Hello, my friends. Welcome to the deep dive into the world of music. And as always, we're talking about all things AI music, how we got to where we are today. Music way back in the biblical age, all the way to the 1800s, 1600s, that era, the classical era. And we're going to journey into the present. So let's begin talking about why this evolution. How did music evolve into the world of AI? You see, in the world of music, every seismic shift has redefined who holds the power and how artists and creators thrive. Today, we're standing on the edge of another transformation, one where AI music is creating a new frontier. To really understand why this matters, we need to look back and see how the music business evolved in the very first place. Once upon a time, before the record labels even existed, music found its way to people through live performances and word of mouth. From the musicians of biblical times like David to Beethoven's era, where there was no middleman, just pure artistry. Over time, labels emerged and took control, shaping what got heard and who got famous. Fast forward to the digital age, and we saw those labels challenged by social media, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and streaming. And now, with AI music, we're in a whole new ballgame where anyone can become their own label. That's right. Even you could be a threat. Now, in this short course, I'm going to walk you through that journey from the past to the present and into the future so you can understand the power of shifts, the power of opportunity, the challenges, and even the power that you wield. And most importantly, you'll see how you can navigate as a musician, as an independent, as a business enthusiast, and maybe even thrive in this new era of AI-driven creativity. Now, I want you to understand that in the very ancient times, long before the age of Beethoven, the roots of music run deep. And we're talking about biblical eras. Music was communal. It was a spiritual experience, often shared in gatherings, in celebrations and religious ceremonies. Think of the Psalms. Those were songs. David wrote a lot of those. Those were sung in ancient Israel, or the instruments like the lyres and the harps that brought people together. There was no record label, there was no UMG or Sony back then. Just musicians and their audiences sharing melodies passed down through generations. And as we move forward into the classical era, figures like Beethoven, Mozart composed pieces, masterpieces, without the need for a recording industry. Think about how music must have been those days. It was either performed live in courts and concert halls or shared through sheet music. It was a world where creativity flowed freely. And the idea of a label, that wasn't even a thing. That was something of the future. So from those early days, what we're going to do is trace the journey forward. And we're going to see how the rise of record labels, centralized control, and how digital and social revolutions began to loosen that grip. And now we arrive at an exciting new dawn of AI music with firms like Producer AI and Suno and Udio in the forefront of discussions where the past meets the future in a whole new way. And diving into this next era, we can see how things evolved after the classical era. So I call this the birth of record labels and how the industry took shape. As we step into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the concept of the record label begins to emerge. At first, these were small companies focused on producing and distributing recorded music on physical media like the phonograph cylinders and later vinyl records. Vinyl is still alive today, and companies like Columbia Records and Victor Talking Machine Company were pioneers. They realized that by recording artists and distributing their music, they could reach a much wider audience and, of course, make some money along the way. You see, these labels essentially created a new business model. They invested in talent, produced recordings, and then sold those recordings to the public. And over time, as technology advanced, these labels grew in power and influence, shaping popular music for decades to come. So from these humble beginnings, the industry evolved into what we know as the big three labels: Sony, Universal, and Warner, who came to dominate the market. And now, as we stand at the edge of the AI music era, we see these giants grappling with a new kind of disruption, That's right. We see them grappling with the threat of artificial intelligence. So way back in time, not too far back, we began to see the early pioneers in the early 1900s. One of my favorite artists way back, Bing Crosby, came onto the scene in 1930s and 40s, and he was a huge star who really benefited from the growing recording industry. And he helped popularize the idea of crooners and the radio era. And then you've got blues legends like Howlin' Wolf emerging later on in the 1950s, who were a big part of the blues and early rock and roll era that shaped modern music. And of course, when you think about figures who were not singers like Harold Lloyd, Charlie Chaplin, you're talking about the silent film era. And don't forget, they were not entirely silent. There was music for a lot of those movies. So those guys weren't musicians, but they were huge stars who worked in parallel with the rise of recorded sound and the entertainment industry. And then if we go even further back, we have recording artists from the early 20th century, like the opera singers and the vaudeville performers who were among the first to be recorded. And it's extremely fascinating to look at the tapestry of artists that were involved. Now, digging a little bit deeper, let's spotlight some of those early African-American blues legends, because a story wouldn't be complete without them. And one of the earliest and most influential blues artists was W.C. Handy, often called the father of the blues. You know, I love the blues because it's guttural and it's visceral and it's extremely potent. And a lot of artists today, in all their riffs and runs, are leaning heavily into the blues. So we got to talk about the blues. W.C. Handy was one of the first to publish blues sheet music in the early 1900s, helping to bring blues into the mainstream. And then you have legends like Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith. You can find these recordings on YouTube. You'll be quite impressed, I can assure you. And some of the earliest recorded blues singers in the 1920s, they were so incredibly influential, and they paved the way for so many artists after them. And of course, you might have heard of Robert Johnson if you're into the blues. 1930s, he became mythical in the blues world, and his recordings influenced countless musicians later on. And these early blues artists really laid the foundation for what would become blues, jazz, and rock. A huge part of the Big Three catalog, if you ask me.
Woke up this morning, the sky was still blue, but that ain't stopped the trouble, Lord, that I'm going.
So they're definitely key players that we need to speak about right now. So while the groundwork was definitely laid in those early decades, speaking about the record label explosion and how vinyl records really took hold, we're talking about after the Second World War, around the 1940s, 1950s. That was the era when the 78 RPM records started to give way to the 33 and a third LPs and the 45 RPM singles, and that really changed everything. It made records more accessible, more affordable, and it became a golden age for vinyl. So if we had to pinpoint a real boom, the late 40s and into the 50s was the great marker for when vinyl took off. And vinyl is still around till today. People will swear by vinyl. But let's talk about some of those labels way back that really made waves before the Big Three took hold. So in the 1940s and 50s, a big one that comes to mind is Atlantic Records, founded in 1947. Atlantic became huge in R&B, jazz, and eventually rock and roll. They signed artists like Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin, so they were really influential. Another big player from that era is Chess Records, founded in the 1950s in Chicago. Chess was huge in the blues scene, bringing artists like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Chuck Berry, brought them to prominence, and they played a huge role in shaping the sound of modern blues and rock. And of course, you can't forget Capitol Records, which was founded a little bit early in 1942. So by the 50s, they were a major force in pop and rock music, signing artists like Frank Sinatra and eventually the Beatles. So these are just a few of the big names that really defined the golden era of vinyl. If you go way back even before then, because you ask, what was the very first record? Yeah. So Emil Berliner's Berliner Gramophone Company was the beginning of this whole discussion, and he invented the gramophone. So let's talk a little bit about that. So backing up just a tad into the 1890s, we meet Emil Berliner, the inventor of the gramophone. And the Berliner Gramophone Company is credited as the first record label. And we see that as a highlight. That eventually was followed by many other labels like Columbia and Victor, and we'll talk about these all throughout the timeline. One of the very first artists, you could say the earliest artist to be signed to a label, was actually Enrico Caruso. He was a famous Italian opera singer, and he signed with the Victor Talking Machine Company in the early 1900s. Caruso's recordings became wildly popular and really helped establish the whole concept of recorded music as a commercial product. So we can definitely put him there as one of the first major artists to be signed and recorded by a record label. So to give further context, Emil Berliner's Berliner Gramophone Company eventually got absorbed into larger entities. Over time, it became part of the Victor Talking Machine Company, and then eventually the Victor Company merged into what became known as RCA Victor. So in a way, the original label was kind of the first seed that grew into these much bigger companies, and it was absorbed into larger recording companies over time. RCA Victor eventually became part of even bigger fish. In the 1980s, RCA Records, I still remember the RCA logo on tons of my mom's records, right? So the RCA record company was eventually acquired by Bertelsmann, a German media company, and then later RCA became part of Sony BMG, and now it's part of the Sony Music Group. So it's kind of a tale of continual consolidation over the decades, and the original pieces just kept getting absorbed into bigger and bigger musical conglomerates. And that is how these companies have grown into gargantuan proportions. You might have watched the movie The Sound of Music and all the lovely music from that movie. Well, The Sound of Music eventually ended up under the umbrella of major labels as well. And we're talking about lots of movie soundtracks, but just using The Sound of Music as an example. It was originally released by RCA Victor in the late 60s, and we just talked about RCA Victor becoming part of the musical chain that ended up with Sony. So songs like Do a Dear, Female Dear, and all that stuff ended up being part of the Sony catalog. And it's kind of interesting how these beloved classics have been passed down through different labels, and they now sit with one of the biggest music companies of the world. And it's rather fascinating, isn't it? It's very thought-provoking. A lot of the descendants of those early pioneers, they don't really see the benefits, while the big labels that consolidated everything ended up owning the rights and profits. You know, it's a story you see a lot in music history. Those who created or inspired the art or the genre often, unfortunately, didn't reap long-term rewards for their descendants. But I'm glad that we're talking about this because it's getting you more tuned and enlightened into what happened. So, as of now, we have the big three: Universal, Warner, and Sony. We got to keep talking about those names because they own a massive chunk of the music industry. They have some rather major shareholders, though. So when you talk about UMG, a big chunk of it is owned by the Bolloré Group, owned through Vivendi, and Tencent also has a significant stake here, but for Sony Music, it's fully owned by Sony Corporation. And for Warner Music Group, a firm called Access Industries holds the major stake. So it's a mix of parent companies and big investment groups. But let's dive even a little bit deeper. So as of now, Universal Music Group has a pretty significant chunk, about 31.94% owned by Vivendi and Vincent Bolloré combined. Tencent holds around 1.45%. So those are the biggest players in the world of UMG. So to sum it up, besides the stakes held by Vincent Bolloré, Vivendi, and Tencent, you've got other institutional investors in UMG like Pershing Square, CIG with a few percent each. So basically, the rest of that roughly 60% is spread out among various institutional and public shareholders. Now you understand why the aggression to get the industry on lock. It's because they've got so many diverse investors. So UMG, again, mammoth. Now let's talk about Sony Music. It's actually a bit more straightforward. Sony Music, like I said, is wholly owned by the Sony Group Corporation, which is the big Japanese conglomerate. So there's no separate outside majority shareholder in the same way. It's basically just part of the larger Sony family. And they run it as a division of the overall corporation. And you know, Sony's into everything from appliances all the way on down to media. So Sony is owned by a number of institutional shareholders. The largest chunk is about 18.5% that is held by the Master Trust Bank of Japan. And there are other institutional investors like Moxley & Co., Custody Bank of Japan, and a few others holding smaller percentages. And of course, this is bound to change over time. So it's pretty much in the hands of these big institutional investors. And those big institutional investors basically manage the funds on behalf of a lot of smaller investors. So it could be pension funds, mutual funds, or individual shareholders who have their money in these big institutions. In other words, it's a kind of layered ownership structure. So when you're looking at the CEO of UMG, Lucian Grange, or you're looking at the CEO of Warner, Robert Kinsell, it's important to understand they represent a lot of stakeholder interests. So at the end of the day, a lot of the smaller investors are involved indirectly. So as of now, the majority of Warner Music Group is owned, as I said, by Access Industries, and they hold about 72% of the equity and control, roughly 98% of the voting power. So they're definitely the big boss in that scenario. There are also some institutional investors like Vanguard and JP Morgan with smaller stakes, but Access Industries is definitely the majority owner. Access Industries is, as you probably guessed, an investment firm, and it's privately held, founded by Len Blavatnik, and they invest in various industries like natural resources, chemicals, media, and of course entertainment. So Warner Music Group is one of their biggest holdings in the entertainment space. It's also worth talking about some of the indie labels. We don't want to forget our friends in the indie world because they've carved out a real meaningful space. So we got to talk about labels like Sub Pop, for example, which helped launch Nirvana, and the whole grunge movement, or XL Recordings, which has Adele and Radiohead on their roster. These labels are not as big as the big three, but they've got influence and credibility. And there's a whole ecosystem of indie labels that are beloved for their niche genres or their artist-friendly approaches. So it's definitely worth talking about. There are a few other notable indies out there. For example, there's Domino Recording Company, which has artists like Arctic Monkeys, Franz Ferdinand, and you also have Merge Records, which was home to bands like Arcade Fire. And there's Epitaph Records for punk and alternative rock, and they had bands like Bad Religion and The Offspring. So there's a whole range of smaller indie labels that have really left a mark in their own genres and continue to have a strong following. So shout out to the indie labels. Now, let's jump back into the mainstream big three, because I want to give you a quick rundown so that you understand their mammoth reach. And let's talk about some of the popular artists that are around today, names that you've probably heard. So Bruno Mars is with Atlantic Records under Warner. Beyonce is with Columbia under Sony. Taylor Swift started with Big Machine, and now she's with Republic under Universal. Kanye's label is in existence, Good Music label, but Kanye himself is with Def Jam, which is under Universal as well. Do you see the play of interpolations of artists and their labels, and they're under one label, but they've got other labels. Ludacris is also with Def Jam. Busta Rhymes has bounced between Flip Mode and Aftermath. Christina Aguilera is with RCA under Sony. Billie Eilish under Dark Room, and Interscope under Universal. And for jazz legends like my favorite, Herbie Hancock, he's been with Columbia. Chick Corea, also a favorite of mine, he's been with Concord. And Oscar Peterson was with labels like Verve. And the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, they are managed by Universal now. Michael Jackson's catalog is with Sony. And the Jackson 5 and Janet Jackson also with Sony. And Boyz II Men, a favorite, are with Universal Motown. And finally, another favorite from back in the day, TLC, their catalog is under Sony's LaFace label. So when you take a look at the broad spectrum, my friends, it's a mix of many. And there are other names of artists, current and in memory, that are under these big labels. They are gargantuan, and I hope this gives you some insights into why there is such a music war going on right now. Now, let's take where we ended in the 1950s, 60s, and let's switch to the coming of AI music. The AI music revolution goes way back into the roots of computer-generated or algorithmic music. Actually, let's start around the 1950s and 60s when computer scientists and composers like Leger and Hiller started experimenting with generating music using algorithms. Then, over the decades, we saw more advancements like in the 80s and 90s. You had experiments with neural networks and early AI models making simple compositions. It was pretty rough around the edges, but it was the beginnings. Now we can fast forward to the 2010 and the 2020s, and we see a real enormous leap. AI music tools started becoming more coherent, more user-friendly, and models got more sophisticated with deep learning, and suddenly you have these platforms like Suno, Udio, and others popping up. Now we could go way back and talk about a few more between the early 2000s to the 2010 era, but let's just fast forward to where we are today. We've got a whole system of these AI music tools that are way more advanced and accessible. So now you've got platforms like Moises, Producer AI, that let people remix separate tracks easily. You've got Tunee, you've got Sonauto, which I've talked about a lot on this channel, which are making waves. And even the big names like 11 Labs and OpenAI, they're working on music-related projects. So it's really a dynamic and exciting time. And the collaboration between indie creators and AI is just opening up all sorts of possibilities. So when you think about the big three, Universal, Sony, and Warner, they definitely targeted Udio and Suno because those platforms are the most prominent and capable in the AI music space right now. They're the ones making headlines, gaining traction, and frankly producing AI-generated music that's really catching on. Suno especially. So from the big label's perspective, it makes sense for them to focus on the biggest players in the field. They're worried that those platforms setting the tone, potentially using their copyrighted material for training and just generally reshaping the industry is a huge threat. Smaller platforms might still be flying under the radar, underground, and I know for a fact, based on what I've heard on social media, that a lot of those exist. But Udio and Suno have just reached that level of prominence where the big three felt, yeah, we got to step in here. So it really boils down to where the biggest perceived threat is. And you might ask, well, haven't there been other threats such as, I think about Arranger keyboards. And Arranger keyboards like the Genos 2, the Korg PA5X, yeah, those are great. They've been around for a while in different shapes and sizes. Have definitely gotten a lot more intelligent. And while they're fantastic tools for musicians, they've never really been a massive threat. They've been more about giving an individual musician the ability to create backing tracks and arrangements on the fly, but they're not really set up to generate full original compositions the same way AI platforms are. You might also ask, well, what about Pro Tools? Why wasn't Pro Tools looked at as a threat? Well, Pro Tools is pretty much just a template. It's a work stream. It's a workflow. Definitely have cut out a lot of studios But that wasn't the concern of the music labels. The labels were all about what is a threat to them. So having records go out of existence, they knew that the next medium, they just need to control that. If the music studios went away, people still need their music. So where is the cheese? Where is the sugar trail? Big labels are always looking for where the biggest threat is. Now, AI music tools are such a huge threat because they generate entirely new pieces of music with minimal input, which can scale up or potentially flood the market in ways that a range of keyboards never could. And that's why the labels are paying a lot more attention for AI. So when we look at UMG, we look at Warner, we look at Sony, they all have a pretty hefty roster of well-known artists, and we're talking about hundreds of top-tier artists. I've already mentioned a few, but to go back to Universal, they've got artists like Taylor Swift, Drake, The Weeknd, Billie Eilish, so you know, a really large number of household names. Warner, huge roster, Ed Sheeran, Cardi B, Bruno Mars, all under Warner. And then with Sony, you've got Beyonce, you've got Adele, you've got Harry Styles, just to mention a few. And remember, all of these are under labels that are under the bigger labels. So each of these big three, they've got hundreds of A-list artists, top tier. So if you really wanted to look at a ballpark, you would say at least a few hundred apiece, maybe 200 to 300 really globally recognized names per label from all sorts of genres. And that's why there is so much at play. So in 2024, when you take a look at all these artists under these labels, you might want to ask the question, how much are they really getting from streaming? Well, in total, streaming makes up about 61% of the recorded music industry's revenue. Think about that. 61%. That's around 22 billion globally. Universal, Sony, Warner, they all take a big share of that. For example, in 2024, Universal pulled in about 10.5 billion in revenue. Sony around 7.9 billion, and Warner about 5.6 billion. Dollars, that is. And they're still very dominant. But indie labels and independent artists are also gaining ground. So a huge part of the big labels' revenue is really coming from streaming platforms. And that's why they are aggressively working on collaborations and going against people who could usurp their dominance. In 2024, Universal Music Group pulled in about 6 billion euros from streaming alone. And around 77% of that came from subscription services like Spotify, Apple Music, and the rest from ad-funded platforms like YouTube. Now, they don't break it down by platform specifically, but it's safe to say that a huge number of those comes from Spotify, from Apple, and YouTube combined. Now, let's break that down further with a rough estimate. So if Universal pulled in about 10.5 billion in revenue and about 6 billion euros from streaming, which is roughly the bulk of that, then we can estimate how many plays that might represent. So on average, a stream might pay out around $0.003 to best case $0.005 depending on the platform. So if we take a midpoint, let's say about $0.004 per stream, then you'd need roughly 2.5 billion streams to earn $10 million. So just think about what you would need to make billions. To get into the billions of dollars, we're talking about trillions of streams total across the entire catalog. Big numbers. It's a staggering number of plays that all add up into those billions of revenues. So from a revenue perspective, big chunks come from ads, especially on platforms like YouTube that run ad-supported streams, but a huge portion also comes from subscriptions. Services like Spotify and Apple Music where users pay a monthly fee, so it's a combination of ad revenue and those subscription fees, and it all adds up to that big pile of streaming money, that big pile of streaming income that the labels are getting. Now it totally makes sense why they're sensitive about it. Aside from streaming, they're definitely pulling in revenues from a few other resources, such as physical sales. They're still getting around vinyl, CDs. I know it's very low, but vinyl has actually made a bit of a comeback recently, so there's money there. And then there's a good chunk of income from licensing, like when music is used in movies, TV shows, commercials, and video games. And of course, there's the whole live music side. Let's not forget concerts, tours, merch sales. And they can get a cut if they're involved in those deals. So they've got a different revenue stream beyond just streaming. But streaming is definitely the biggest piece of the pie right now. I really hope you're enjoying the story so far. If you are, then smash that like button, like and subscribe. But let's move a little bit further and talk about this entire landscape. Now, it's not a monopoly, let's get that straight. But one way that the big three use their influence to maintain their dominant position, to put their weight on the market, so to speak, is through their relationships with streaming platforms. They can negotiate better terms, they can get prime placements on playlists, and they can push their artists to the front. They've also got a lot of control over catalog music, those classic hits that everyone wants to listen to, where your childhood is trapped. Yes, they have a strong negotiating position there as well. And they can invest heavily in marketing and promotion to keep their artists at the top. So all of those things together help them keep a pretty firm grip on the industry. So you, as an independent, if you are an independent, might be wondering, how can I harness the tools that are available through Suno and Udio and Producer AI and Tunee and Sonauto? Well, you can embrace tools like that to not only compose, but to help you create a funnel of your own so that you can get your music through tools like DistroKid or TuneCore, or those of you who have gone through Lander, or you remember CD Baby back in the day. Yeah, you can get your music on all streaming platforms without a record label. And also, don't underestimate the power of collaboration. Some of you in my AI Creatives Connect membership group, you can work with each other. Just make sure you strike a very good understanding and good agreements, and you can work together to amplify your reach. It's definitely possible. Personally, I have so much going on the table right now, but I'm looking forward to the time where I can offer consulting services to help those of you who are looking to firm up your sound. I'm not there right now, but I'm getting there. But I'm looking for you folks to look outwardly. I've also told some of you who are looking for real-life singers to sing your songs to go onto platforms like Fiverr and Upwork and look for people who offer music services. Singers, rappers, songwriters, musicians. You can find so many folks out there. So, my friends, in conclusion, we've been talking about the music industry from biblical times through classical era all the way to where we are today. We've talked about Universal, Sony, and Warner. We've talked about them having a huge share of the top artists in the world and how they use their influence to keep that position, especially through streaming, licensing, and their big back catalogs. And we've touched on how indie artists and AI tools are changing the game, giving independent creators more ways to break through. Now, looking ahead at the business case for the future of AI music, if there's no major disruptor, no new Suno or similar platform that shakes things up, the big three will likely keep doing what they're doing. They'll integrate AI into their own operations, sign deals with, I know, irritating. That's the right word. But they'll sign deals with the best AI tools and maintain a lot of control. The breaking point, though, could come from a wave of indie artists using AI tools. If AI tools keep becoming more popular, that they start to rival the big three's dominance, that's when you could see a real shift. Now you know why a funded campaign to blackball AI musicians to make it sound like they're committing sacrilege by using AI music would make sense. If we can just push the narrative that AI music is repulsive and slop, then we could play the AI game to our advantage. People will listen to AI covers more readily then they'll listen to new AI slop. Now you understand the dynamic, and you can look introspectively and you can ask, am I a puppet? Or am I able to think freely and independently? Am I a pawn in the hands of those trying to control the narrative? Or am I truly an independent? So the bottom line is this. The future is wide open. If indie creators keep pushing and new disruptors step up, we might see the landscape change in a big way. If not, the big three will probably keep their grip for a while. But there's a lot of potential for the independents like you, like me, like your neighbors, to challenge the industry. And I'm all up for a big old challenge. I love challenges. I love pushing the status quo. And if that excites you, let the journey continue. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you on the next discussion.